I'm Deborah Williams. I'm the Executive Director of the Anchorage Youth Development Coalition and here for one of your proposed ordinance changes.
Lauren Bress, Northeast Community Council.
Dick Tremaine, Rabbit Creek Community Council.
Darrell Hess, Municipal Ombudsman.
Daniel George, Mountain View Community Council.
There you go. All right, so first things first, after our last meeting, Assembly Council was gonna go back and make some revisions to the proposed ordinance. Did everybody get those and have a chance to look at them? Julia, I was hoping you might be able to just to go through and briefly discuss the changes we made from the original version.
You want me to start with that now?
Yes, please.
Okay, so we'll just go, and I'll just explain my understanding of what, the direction I had from, Mr. Trady. In the, first section, 010, this is basically, right out of the charter, so I did, the heading now is establishment and procedures, and there's nothing there. And so there's, the first paragraph there was in the prior draft, and that is verbatim from the charter. The second paragraph there, I added to bridge the charter language to what we were doing here. And then because the word establishment showed up in more than one section heading, I thought it was clearer to put, to rename it community councils and procedures. The purpose is the same basically as in the, as we discussed the last time. Then beginning with 030, definitions is broken out from recognition, because in order, we spent more than half our time during the last meeting talking about how to describe membership, and how once membership was described, how to keep track of it. And so those changes are seen there, and the thing that, the item that the Ombudsman and I talked about was in the language of the current code, it refers to homeowners, tenants, and other dwelling within the council properties, and then it has property owners and representatives of nonprofit associations and other entities. And we weren't quite sure what the other entities were, and to be voting, it just seemed reasonable that you were going to fall into, you're going to be a resident, and for residency, I borrowed from the charter definition of residency, and then the other categories, property owner, that property owner record seemed relevant, and then in the business and not-for-profit associations, it seemed like we would know that you were a business or a nonprofit association if you had a business license, because nonprofits are licensed by the state. So that's all built in now to that definitional section. Then a new section breaks out recognition. So instead of having definitions and recognition sort of merged together in 030, definitions are in 030, and the process for recognition is given its own section, and most of that is as it was in the initial draft, but ties into the new 030 section. We spent some time talking last time about bylaw provisions, and there's the draft talked about bylaw provisions, and what we talked about last time was that there was a potential dilemma that if the sort of mandatory bylaw provisions that you needed for recognition were now to be codified, then what would happen when for those that didn't have any bylaws on file, or had bylaws that didn't meet the code. And so this section D on page 6 has a provision for pre-approved bylaw provisions, which the Ombudsman has been has been working on. There was some housekeeping that needed to be done about Girdwood. One section looked like, it said Girdwood is not considered a community council for purposes of the section, that's current code, and then current code also says that the municipality recognizes the Girdwood Board of Supervisors as the community council ex officio. So we talked about last time that those were somewhat in conflict, so we did the housekeeping on that. Then 040 is the second one that had establishment, and it just seemed reasonable to call that what it was, which was establishment of community council districts. And so there isn't any new language in that from last time, and the only language that we found that needed, the only housekeeping that we found as of last time that we needed to clean up was that the code had actually been amended in 2004 to add Midtown Community Council, and that one's not shown in the present list, so that's just as it was. Then we have the functions, and the function that we added to the draft last time and is retained here is on the back of page 10, which is advising the Assembly of the Community Council's annual priority list of capital improvement projects as submitted to the administration, because oftentimes there isn't a loop back on that, so the Assembly would want to build that into their legislative priorities also, and this way we get that from the Assembly would be getting that from the Community Council. Under paragraph B, and B's the same, C is the same as in the last draft. The maps are the same, and that's it. So as you see, most of the changes that are in there dealt with the recognition and how to create a fallback bylaws.
Perfect, and I just want to point out that Mr. Butler has joined us from the Federation of Community Councils, and Mr. Hall is here. He just stepped out in the hallway for just a second. Are there any comments to start with? We'll just open it right up. Yes, Lauren.
I'm still very concerned about the disenfranchisement of the voter, how we require a resident to attend at least 2 meetings in the past 12 in order to be able to vote for the person that's going to represent them in between meetings. We're supposed to be representing our community, and we allow them to vote for everything else. However, we're putting restrictions on who's going to be able to vote for those representing them in between meetings, the executive board. And we don't require that for even voting for the President of the United States. We don't require that for the Assembly either. I don't think that this is a good idea.
Well, this doesn't require that. This allows the Community Council to require that as they, so it doesn't forbid it, but it doesn't require that. And I haven't drilled down into the sample. Does your sample bylaw, have you gotten that far yet on the sample bylaws?
We can talk about the sample bylaw in more detail later on, because there are some things I put in there that are not a code requirement, but a lot of community councils have in place. Currently, out of the 34 bylaws I read, I think 30 at least require some prior attendance within the previous 6 to 12 months. It's allowed now. Most councils do it now. And all this is doing is, because we're loosening up the requirements, we're saying now if you come to a council meeting, sign the register, and you're a member and you can vote, which is, you know, a more representative approach in some people's opinion, which is what you're arguing for. But I think it's also the recognition that that is something that the community councils, you know, should be left up to the community councils. And I would, based on my 10 years as a council officer and 5 years as a president, and reviewing the current bylaws of councils, if we tried to mandate that councils cannot do that, you would have 200 people show up at the public hearing at the Assembly opposing that. So it's not, your council, you know, you're on record, your council doesn't support that concept. They don't have to do it under the current code or under this proposed amendment. They don't have to do it if your council doesn't want to.
Mr. Brett?
The code says that the council is supposed to be representative of the community. if the community can't vote for who's representing them, then they're violating the municipal code, the charter. I have asked questions why this is in place, or why it's being suggested to be even allowed. And there was concerns brought up as to that somehow or another the ballots could be stacked, and it's like, I don't see how that can be. Everybody always wants to get out the vote. What we at the Northeast Community Council have put in place is requirements for who's eligible to be a representative, because we do want elected officials that are going to do their job. And so we put a requirement that they have attended at least 3 of the past 5 meetings, so that they know what's going on, so that they understand what the community council's about, and that becomes their slate of representatives that are candidates. But everybody gets to vote.
So,
Yeah, go
go ahead, Julia, you have a question.
So, I don't have a question, I have a comment, so go ahead with your question.
Okay, oh no, I was gonna go to Mr. Steele and Mr. Tremaine.
I can understand the concern. I remember being at a community council, I forget what the issue was, but where there was a huge, a particular interest in the community council district showed up with maybe 100 people at the meeting and just ran over the meeting. I think it was election of officers. And so I suspect most of them had not been to a community council meeting for a long time, if at all. And so there is some value of the community council being able to say you had to have been there a certain period of time. And I think that's why it's recommended, or it's in there as allowing it, not mandating.
Mr. Tremaine?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. You know, it's true that community councils represent the people at the most common and base level. And as with elections, anybody should be able to vote, but as with elections for municipality or the state or federal government, you have to pre-register. You can't just walk in and say, I'm going to vote. It's not an open vote. It is for members who have come in and registered to vote prior. And what I see happening here is defining that pre-registration as previous attendance. And there's some latitude as to what that means. So I think it's entirely consistent with the voting laws that we have in the United States at all levels.
Pepper?
I think that, and I would look to the assembly members to correct me on this, but my understanding is that in looking at the current code, that as Mr. Hess said, the charge of the assembly is to give maximum latitude to the community councils. And so here, there's a limit, so it can't be any more than 2 prior meetings. I'll just finish my statement. And so as a lawyer, I don't think that that's an unreasonable requirement. And so, and the community council will vote in the bylaws. And so you have representation just like you do on other things. So we have sent a copy of this to the Department of Law, who hopefully will also weigh in on defining the legal parameters of what can and can't be under the charter required by the Assembly of Community Councils in terms of bylaws. And so that's sort of how I think that will pan out.
Yes, Ms. Fretz?
It appears that it would have the potential to be more restrictive than the voting for the assembly. Yes, there is a prior registration period for, is it 30 days out, whatever the period is. But this is more restrictive than voting for an assembly. And I don't think it's good practice. I don't think we need to go as lenient as voting for the president, which is same-day registration. And you can vote for the President of the United States. But it should not be more, we should not allow more restrictive than on the assembly level.
Daryl?
I think the key here is, I heard somebody referred to, I believe it was Mr. Brett, referred to community council officers as elected officials. Are not elected officials. Community councils are not part of government. They are private, voluntary, self-governing associations. And because they are recognized in the charter and they're enabled by ordinance, we can put some high-level requirements on them. But municipal government can't micromanage them. And the issue is really, if you don't put it in the code, it's not in the code now, which means councils can do it if they choose to. All we're doing is putting in the code, right into the code, something that's already allowed. The only way to prohibit that would be to rewrite the code and say that councils can't do that. And I don't think you would see much community will from community councils to support that. The tradition has been for 36, 37 years that most community councils have reasonable requirements for pre-attendance of meetings when voting. And it's the community councils, up to the community councils, individual councils, to decide whether or not they want that in their bylaws or they want that policy. Your council voted it down. Your council doesn't want it, but other councils may desire to have it in their bylaws. And when I see it in over 30 current bylaws, I think that I would assume that the majority of community councils would like to see that. So I think it would be a mistake to prohibit it in code.
Mr. Trini? And then
The
Kathy?
reason I put this in here is because I was president of community council for about 8 years. We had a bar come in, and they wanted to take over community council because we had elections that night. They marched in with 50 people. Our bylaws said you had to attend one meeting before you could be an officer. They wanted to elect new officers and couldn't. So because they hadn't been to the community council before, they just wanted to come and take it over that night and elect their own president to get a bar in our neighborhood. This is the only thing that protected our community council from being taken over. The requirement that they had to attend at least 1 or 2 community councils to run for office. So that's the reason I put this in here. So blame me for it. I wanted to protect the community councils from being a hostile takeover, which we've all been involved in hostile issues. We know what happens. That's why this is here.
Kathy?
I guess I'm a little bit confused because I don't even know what section you're referencing, but I think it must be on page 6, eligibility to vote. So are we talking about eligibility to vote or eligibility to run for
Run for officer,
office?
we're talking about 12A.
Okay, so, so voting, but that's voting.
For officers in elections.
Right,
All
but
these
it's
officers.
not that somebody running for, you don't have a requirement that they have to have attended, like you actually have in your bylaws. But there's nothing in here for what an officer may be required before they could be put on a ballot. Is that, am I,
Actually, the
two
current
different
code
things?
and the
right?
revised code says that the election of officers, their duties, how many officers, that's up to the community councils to decide.
Okay, well, going back to the voting then, with Turnigan, we don't have any restrictions on voting with regular motions and regular resolutions on our agenda. We do have restrictions that they have to have attended once within the last 12 months to vote for officers and board members. And, you know, I mean, honestly, that's about as lenient as you can get. I mean, if somebody hasn't attended a council meeting in over a year, then for them to come in and say, we want him to be our president, and they haven't been engaged actively in the council at any level for over a year, I think it's reasonable. And I don't feel like we're disenfranchising anyone. And, you know, in our agenda, we give warning, there's elections coming up. If you're interested in running, we're gonna be having them in our November meeting. If somebody really wants to be able to vote, then they should come to the October meeting and then come to the November meeting. I mean, you know, it's not that difficult. And I agree with Mr. Trainee that we've all been there, those of us who have been involved with councils for a long period of time, me 31 years, we have seen on rare occasions where Turnigan that's happened at Turnigan meetings. Doesn't happen very often. But you see a whole crowd of people who have never, ever attended a meeting and then want to sway a vote. We don't have restrictions on that for regular meeting, but we think when it's when it's election time, we probably should draw the line, so that doesn't happen. It's reasonable to me.
Julia?
I just wanted to make the point that what we're talking about here are policy issues, because there's no legal requirement to either, in my legal opinion, there's no municipal legal requirement to restrict it or to not restrict it. If you are restricting it, it has to be a reasonable restriction for reasons as Ms. Gleason had said. And so I only wanted to, in responding to Lauren's comment, just because he was saying that, in his opinion, it was illegal, I don't think that is a reason, but there could be plenty of policy reasons either way for doing it, and that's why the Assembly gets to set policy on, on things like this, but it is a policy call, from my view.
Lauren?
This is a question, question and a statement. If it's sad when 50 people can sway a vote, when we're supposed to be, at least in my council area, there's upwards of 10,000 people that we're representing. But is it possible to allow the community councils to change their bylaws to restrict the vote to at least attending 2 meetings before they're allowed to vote on any issue?
I think that the same rule would apply, that if, as a policy matter, the Assembly could find that there was a reasonable basis to require all community councils to have bylaws that said that you had to attend before you voted on anything, that that the Assembly could do that. I think that the test for it would be tougher to find the reasonable basis for doing that. And for that reason, the discussion here last time was that as a policy matter, and the way this is written, if you're present and you sign the register, then you're a member and you vote. And that the reasonableness of voting for officers is grounded in having some prior attendance that elevates your awareness and knowledge of issues to be able, as Ms. Gleason said, and that is totally up to the community councils to make that call when they vote in their bylaws.
I think also the issue would be if you try to have attendance requirements just simply for voting on motions and sending a letter to the mayor or the Assembly or something, that would be, and I agree with you, that would be disenfranchising people. But it goes back to the nature of the community councils that the officers only communicate the positions that the members vote. So even if those individuals can't vote for the officers, they can vote on the motions, the resolutions, the letters, anything that president is going to communicate, because that president has to communicate what the membership votes, the position the membership votes. So I think that's also should be taken into account.
Mr. Trainee?
We've all had community councils, we've all been presidents of them, and sometimes people only come up if you're putting a road down the middle of their house. Or you're putting the highway to highway bypass through your neighborhood. Then we have 250 people show up. That issue comes up, all 250 people should be able to vote on it. The next meeting, they may have 6 people show up, because you're not putting a road down their house. This is designed to ensure maximum participation. Let every issue short of officers, every member, everybody that belongs to your community council, by the fact of where they live or they own a business there, should be able to vote on every issue in front of them, other than officers, because that's the only one they want to see protection in.
Mr. Schmaden?
I'd like to point out, no matter what you have in your bylaws, that a motion can be made to override the bylaws and requires a 2/3 vote. if you've got 50 people coming into your meeting, and they can vote on other things except officers, they also can move to override the bylaws, and they can do what they want to do.
Is that,
Yep.
is
I
that
don't think
Robert's
so. I
rules?
think that they have to have notice that they are amending the bylaws. That's how corporation law works, whether, and so, in order to have notice to amend the bylaws, you
Well,
have to.
that's not amend the bylaws, that's to override the bylaws under Robert's Rules of Order.
I guess I would disagree that Robert's Rules of Order, what happens with Robert's Rules of Order is that, at least if it's, and maybe that's something that we should clarify in here, is that, the intent is to have Robert's Rules of Order come into play on anything that just like with the Assembly, on anything that there isn't, that isn't addressed specifically in the bylaws. So the Robert's Rules of Order for substantive things are supplement what you already have actually in code. So if Robert's Rules of Order can't, in this code, it says that everybody has to, if you come and you, that the bylaws have to allow that if somebody comes and registers that they get to vote. Well, they can't vote to override code. This code also says that the bylaws can provide that one or up to one, but no more than two, or, up to one or two meetings can be required by the bylaws. And so I think it would be a hard call, and I would caution against thinking that you can override a bylaw without having notice and opportunity for people to vote.
Well, there are some councils that have that in their bylaws.
Yeah, but that's why the code has this code has some mandatory provisions that come into that.
But a lot of the bylaws, as some of the councils, like ours, have it in there that these bylaws can be overridden by a 2/3 vote.
Okay, so what you're saying is that to answer Lauren's question, sort of, or his concern, is that not only, if I can restate that not only is it up to councils to, under this code, to decide if it's one or two, or zero, those that decide one or two can also put into their bylaws that their bylaws can be overridden by 2/3 votes. And if those bylaws are approved by the Assembly, then, as they have to be now, as they have to be under this code, but are not now, that then you could jump that. And so those of you who have bylaws that are like that and want to be able to have that restriction, you should make sure that there's not a conflict.
Okay, I think this particular issue is one that's not gonna be solved here today, but it's a good one to vet in the other community councils to see if other councils have an issue with it. So if we can, I'd like to move on to the next issue, if anybody has issues about, I have a feeling, I know somebody's gonna bring up the 16, 17-year-old age limit, but I'm waiting for that, so, we'll see.
I have a quick question. Is there anywhere in current code or any proposed that references Robert Rules of Order and that councils follow Robert's Rules of Order?
Yes.
Where is that, so that I
It
have
is
that?
in, on page 6, very fine.
Oh. Yeah, I've got several of those at home. Thanks.
Okay, and so,
Okay, thank
and so again, my interpretation of this, because it's parallel to what happens in the Assembly, is that the Roberts Rules shall apply in all instances, matters, and proceeding not covered by the bylaws. And so then what, I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Al, what Al's contributed here is that the bylaws themselves can have a provision that says that they themselves can be overridden by 2/3 votes at any time, without notice. And so that's a good catch, because if your community council, if Turnigan Community Council wants to have bylaws that restrict voting on officers, under this proposed ordinance, if, as you do now, have restrictions in the bylaws that would allow voting for officers to be restricted to those people who can demonstrate that they've been at one or two meetings in the last 12 months, that your bylaws now could also have this provision that says that anything in there can be overridden by 2/3, and so 2/3 of your community council, if you have that, could override it. But absent that provision, you can't just, under Robert's rules, decide that 2/3 of the vote can override bylaws, because you need that provision to be in your bylaws by the 2/3.
Or conversely, if you want to ensure that those voting requirements for officers are not overridden, your bylaws can contain a provision that the bylaws may not be suspended.
Well, they just don't have to have anything in there on suspension. They should remove the Roberts rules, because you don't want to add, I mean.
But Roberts, it says that Robert's rules does cover anything not covered.
Shall apply in all instances, matters, and proceedings not covered by the bylaws.
Right.
And so if the bylaws cover it by saying that you have to have one meeting, then it's covered. Otherwise, you're in a big, I mean, that's why it's important to know that, because that's the way that we have the same approach to interpretation of the Assembly's code. The Roberts Rules of Order cover assembly procedure on anything not covered in code and charter. And so you don't want to read this to be broader than it is, because there's a whole body of law and interpretation that supports a more restrictive reading of this.
Okay, does anybody else have any other topics they want to ask regarding the specific changes we've made from the last meeting? Mr. Tremaine?
Just a few of them for clarification. Page 3, the second paragraph, we're defining council and community councils. And I want to make, I mean, we all know a lot of these things exist only in our imagination. They're not even anythings. They're just groups of people that call themselves something. And I think that that's qualified under your definition, but I want to make sure. I mean, they're not incorporated.
Right, so,
they're not.
that's right. So what's dropped from this, if you go down to the bottom of page 3,
Okay.
you have the old language that's in small caps and in brackets. And you'll see down there on the second to last line that's represented there, it says now, but is being removed, and representatives from nonprofit associations and other entities. And so Daryl and I had discussions about what are other entities.
No, I'm on the
And
second,
so-
yeah, I'm on the second paragraph, defining council and community
I know,
councils.
and so I'm answering that question.
Okay.
And so what I'm saying is that when we looked at that and we didn't know what other entities were, then in the community council and community council members, that isn't in there anymore. There's no other entities, other such entities, or anything like that. So you have nonprofit, voluntary, self-governing associations. That's what community council are. Then under the next paragraph, the third paragraph, in terms of membership, you're gonna have property owners, that's defined now. You're gonna have business owners, that's defined now. You're gonna have nonprofit associations, that's defined now. And all of those have to be within the geographical areas established by the community council district under the chapter. And so there's no longer this amorphous other associations that happen to meet in your thing. They have to be registered with the state and have a business license, is basically what this means.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I misspoke. I was referring to the first full paragraph, not the second full paragraph. So it began on line 6. But I think it's self-answered because it's kind of the same definition. that we
Could I
currently-
jump in, because I have a quick question just on that?
Go ahead, Kathy.
Sorry, thank you. On that second full paragraph, council and community council shall mean the nonprofit we're not registered, our council is not registered as a nonprofit.
right? And
So
and you don't have
is that
to
a
be.
problem? I mean, if we're defined as a nonprofit, then,
No, this is who your members are of your council, it's not who you are. So I'm the ABC, this is membership shall mean, so as we talk about who can be a member.
First,
Yeah.
you
We're
mean
not
for
talking
line
about-
six
Okay.
of page
We're
six.
talking about the entity, not the members of the entity.
Okay.
Line 6, is that what you're referring
Line
to,
six.
Kathy?
Okay,
Yes, line
all right,
six.
okay, so what, okay, so.
So
Can you
it's a-
just add the word or? Community councils shall mean the nonprofit, comma, voluntary, comma, or self-governing association with that? Because I think what she's saying is it's clearly defining you're a nonprofit and you're voluntary and you're self-governing. but
Okay,
what-
are you for profit?
no, but we're not registered with the state as a nonprofit.
Right, but this doesn't say that you have to be registered with the
I
state.
mean, I don't know
so-
what the definition
We're
of
self-governing.
nonprofit is.
That's why I said.
Right, so the old language said, and it may be, and I'll have to check and see what the,
That's how they've been defined for 37 years.
Well, I obviously went over my head.
yeah.
That was a
But
conclusion.
technically,
But
we're
you're
not,
not for profit.
we're not a
You
nonprofit
gotta recognize
organization.
503C nonprofit.
That's right.
Yeah, and this doesn't require you to be.
Al?
I think we're a self-governing association.
Yeah, and that's why the word "or"
Yeah.
would say,
Yep.
pick one of the three.
Yeah.
And it would be, it seemed a simple fit.
Yeah, see there? That law was worked out. Daryl?
I think the intent of the code originally was to demonstrate that community councils are not for-profit organizations. They're voluntary associations made up of people who qualify for membership and they're self-governing. So I don't think it's intended to be an either-or. I think they are self-governing and they're voluntary. You
I
don't
think-
have to belong to your community
I
council.
think a point to make though is there is accepted terminology that a nonprofit indicates that you are a registered nonprofit.
Yeah.
So when people are reading it that way, I think that's how they're reading it because it's a term that has been used and that's how they're associating it.
I think it could be wrong.
Perhaps
Mark?
moving.
Yes, I would suggest the word, I don't like the or either with respect to the chair of the meeting, because I think, as Al pointed out, they are all those three things. But perhaps instead of nonprofit, maybe we use not for profit, because then that I don't believe has a definition in legal, in the state. But everyone would understand it's a not-for-profit organization.
I think that's a great first.
That's all I did.
Yeah.
Strike the or and put in not for.
Is there a consensus on that?
You're in your dinner tonight, thank you.
Oh, no, it's fine.
Yeah, I guess what I would suggest with that is, because I'm hearing what all of you are saying, is that we remove in that first, in the sentence that begins on line six, we remove the word nonprofit. And then we add a new second sentence to that says that council and community councils, or just say community councils, are not-for-profit organizations. And then we don't have this thing, we've met the intent, you cannot run it for profit, okay? That's the bottom line. There are, you can't do it that way. And yet it keeps the business of voluntary self-governing association going forward.
I'm fine with that.
That's good.
Okay,
good.
and, Mr. George?
Just to underscore that point and not trying to prolong the debate a little bit, but there's two reasons why the use of nonprofit would come into play here. The first I can think of is when folks say, I'd like to contribute to your community council, you're a nonprofit, right? So I can write this off. Well, we are a defining entity, as President Kearney mentioned. Another example recently is we went to register our patrol cars with the DMV, and we can pay $250 for each of our cars to be registered, or we can pay $10 to register as a nonprofit. So there are benefits that are extended to groups that are listed as nonprofits or is recognized as a nonprofit, whether or not they're filing it or not with the IRS. So I was just asking you those in mind.
Right, so how about this? Second sentence, so take out the term nonprofit because of the connotations that you and Kathy have already gone over. And the second sentence says, community councils, of the same definition, community councils are not for-profit organizations. Then you still have the caveat there, but you haven't delved into this thing, because my understanding, and Daryl, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that there are a couple of community councils that have actually registered as
Should be.
nonprofit.
Yeah, my community council is one of them.
Yeah, and so it's not out of the realm that they would want to do it, but not all of them are, and only the ones that are registered nonprofits are gonna be able to have those tax benefits given to the donees.
Only if they're federally recognized, then you write it off in your federal tax.
Right, that's,
Okay,
501c3.
Mr. Bretz, and then Daryl.
501c3s.
I've been requested of me for the Northeast Community Council. I've been made aware that apparently councils can apply for revenue sharing from the states if they register properly as a nonprofit. And that is of concern for me. I'd like the city to take a look at it, because it would change the formula. I mean, the formula wouldn't change, but it would alter the amount of money that the city would be having, and I don't want to go backwards.
Daryl?
I think that's a good point, but community councils can register, I believe, as 501c4s. They don't have the same benefits, and I think the requirements for a lot of the state programs are that you be a 501c3, or certain board requirements. I think that is something to look at, but somebody who donates to a community council isn't going to get the tax write-off. It's like the NAACP, the local unit. We're a 501c4. You don't get a tax write-off if you donate. It has to be a 501c3.
Mark, and then we're gonna move on to the next one.
Yes, however, they can donate to the Federation of Community Councils, and we can pass it on to the individual community councils, and they can therefore write it off, because the Federation of Community Councils is a long-standing 501c3. I have the EIN number
Now I
kind
know
of
where to donate.
etched in my head. And that has happened to numerous councils have done that, and had that passed on over the years I've been
Okay,
associated.
Mr. Tremaine, did you have additional questions?
Oh, yeah.
No, please continue. We have till 4, so.
I'll try not to talk much. Page 6, number 13, beginning on line 25. Just a couple of questions. Section A, under 13, can neither offer nor display candidate endorsements. Now, every election that I've been around and going to community councils, everyone's sitting at that table and everyone's sitting there before, and except Mr. Haskell. Actually, you were involved by being a community council member, sees election brochures. So I see a conflict here, because it's a great forum, and is it intended to be a forum for the handing out of election, I'll use the word propaganda.
No. Okay, I'm not telling
And not by the community council, but as a forum for the candidates themselves, or petition people to make that available to the public.
Mr. Trainee?
Dick, we've always gone to community councils and passed out our brochures. The community council doesn't pass them out. Normally, we do our little presentation while we're running, we pass them out.
But it's display, which means at a community council meeting, if I provide a table as a community council and you put it on there, I have displayed it.
Daryl?
I think the intent here was that councils wouldn't endorse candidates, so perhaps that's what
So
we
we
should change it
can
to.
make
Community
display.
councils shall not endorse candidates. You know, I think that could raise a point, because we always have the
Candidates
brochures,
forum.
that's part of the,
Yeah.
you know, I think we all think the mission of community councils is to have candidate forums. So perhaps it just says community councils shall not endorse candidates. I think that was the intent.
Then that's what we should say.
And then
Good.
Okay, so I'm gonna let
Or
Mr.
give.
Trainee express his solution to this issue.
Julia, just take out display and put give in there, so it'll read, neither offer nor give candidate endorsements,
Yeah, perfect.
and then we're fine.
Thank you. I just asked these questions to find out what you're asking.
You're okay, I understand it.
Yeah, no, that's a really good catch, because it wasn't intended to restrict
Oh, absolutely.
candidates.
Yeah, there's unintended consequences are.
Mr. Tremaine,
Big
please
problem.
continue.
Thank you. B, I understand what you're doing. I'd like to have somebody that kind of looks at all this. I think you may be giving the Board of Ethics a big burden here. I just want you to be thinking about that when you're saying it. It's up to you all if you want to do it.
Yeah, but If I can respond.
Julia, go ahead.
I think that it's gonna be fairly limited, actually. But the reason why I couldn't make it more black and white is because of Girdwood. And so Girdwood Board of Supervisors are considered municipal elected officials. You elect them on a ballot. You also elect LRSA people on small ballots in municipal elections. And so there's already coverage under the ethics code for that. And so it seems to me that rather than prohibiting them from being elected officials and all these other things that you have to do, there are some that could be a conflict. And so we need to have somebody in the one that, the organization that is best suited to do that is the Board of Ethics, which has jurisdiction over elected officials. And so, having said all that, this is a provision that we haven't run by the Board of Ethics yet. And so, we're screening here first, and I think it's a good caveat because they are trying to narrow their burden on disclosures, not enlarge it. Amy, Daryl?
Yeah, go ahead, Daryl.
No, I actually have this one highlighted too. And I hadn't thought about the elected boards, but perhaps we should say elected boards. Because if you have, I don't want to discourage citizens from volunteering, having served on 3 commissions. You have to sign a declaration, conflict declaration. You're supposed to keep it updated. During meetings, you're supposed to declare a conflict of interest. So, we have, 40 volunteer boards and commissions. I just think that might be burdensome and discourage some people from offering to serve. But if there is a need to require persons
Well, the
who
problem
are
is that-
elected.
Right, as you know, some LRSAs are appointed and some are elected. And so it seems to me that the same conflict rule, whatever it is, would apply to the appointed LRSA members to the same extent it would to elected LRSA members. And so that was part of the dilemma there. So I don't
Say, just to
know
disclose.
how you want to do that.
Go ahead, Mr. Tremaine.
Madam Chair, for clarification, currently, who's prohibited from being an officer of a community council?
I think that in code, I don't know of any.
So,
Let me just finish. But what happens is that those people who have been appointed as executives, like for instance, the clerk, went ahead and talked to the municipal ethics person, because as an employee, they have to disclose conflict. And she resigned from being an officer of a board because there was a conflict. And so it seems like everybody, there's a group that is covered, and what happens is that if you don't put it down someplace, then it's an I gotcha when somebody else files a notice of potential violations.
Right. So Madam Chair, we begin with anybody can be an officer, and now we're saying that we're taking a fairly large group of people, active people in the community, and abrogating their civil rights to go in front of an ethics panel. And I just am asking you all to think about that before you say it. I'm not comfortable with it, but I haven't thought about it.
Kathy?
Well, the incident she's referred to, it was Barb Jones, and she was our attorney and secretary treasurer. And she had, when she was hired as ombudsman, she indicated she'd gone to get an opinion, and to the best of my recollection, she was told there is no conflict, but she personally felt conflicted and didn't feel comfortable. So she went ahead and resigned, but I don't believe anybody made her do it, or told her to do it, or anything was mandated that she do it. She did it just as her own, how she felt about it. So I don't know that there actually was a conflict.
Well, I was referring to a situation where she was then clerk.
Well, but,
And so it's a
but
little
she'd
bit
done it
different.
when she was
And so,
hired
yeah.
as ombudsman,
Yeah,
so
and
she
I
was
don't know
already
that I
off.
would've- that I would have found it complicated. So this is a policy call for you guys, and again, I think that the ethics board, I don't think we can implement anything like this without talking to the ethics board anyway.
Mr. Steele?
I just think you might want to disclose that, but we've all been involved in community councils to the extent that sometimes it's difficult to get officers and volunteers to step up. And you don't want to make it onerous. It's a volunteer job, and you're doing it because you're concerned about the community and you want to help. And so, and the Board of Ethics to a certain extent is the same way. You don't want to burden them unnecessarily either. They've got a tough enough job just even with us. So.
Mr. Trini?
I think we could drop this paragraph.
I was going right with you.
I'm thinking what I have to go through every year when I have to follow all my disclosure statements, and all the rest of that stuff. I don't want community councils to ever, officers to ever get into that. I mean, for example, I have to say how much my wife makes as a work, where she works at. And that's nobody's business other than her and who works for it. I just don't want to move them into that arena.
Sure.
They'll hold everything.
An interesting perspective, just in Eagle River, when I was community council president of Chudiac, and then there was a Parks and Rec Board of Supervisors opening. And the way it works in Eagle River is each community council gets one seat, and then the mayor has an appointment. Well, I submitted my application, my resume, and on there I listed I was a Chudiac Community Council, but what I don't want is the Board of Ethics to come back and say, no, council can't have 2 members. Because where are you gonna find somebody who's engaged, who knows the issues without having 2? So for Eagle River, whether it's Chudiac, Eagle River Valley, Southport, now you have to pick somebody who's the mayor's appointment to that particular board that appropriates taxpayer money, and you're gonna pick somebody who's not on the community council. I just would be afraid if the Board of Ethics said, no, you can't do that because you're on Chudiac already. So to me, it's concerning. Al?
I think that we should virtually eliminate that requirement. And if it becomes a problem, we always can come back and address it, but I haven't seen where that's a
Plus, the
problem.
people who are, to learn in there, the people who are already municipal employees have access to the board that way, so it's not like we're leaving them blank. This is mostly something to let them know that the board, basically the Board of Ethics is available, but I think that it as you're talking about it, it sort of defeats its purpose and has, and it's like making it look like, the Board of Ethics is gonna be out there, so, there's no legal requirement to put this in there.
So
in my
It's a
view, so-
policy issue, and we're not
It's a
taking
pol-
it forward.
And you're what?
We're not taking it forward.
Okay, so I have it scratched
You
out on my
respond.
copy.
In my copy, it's
Okay,
gone.
all right, so.
All right, is it Mr. Tremaine?
Still, if I may?
Okay, I'm gonna start a timer pretty soon. I'm just kidding.
You
Go ahead.
You should. Okay, page 10, the E, line 8. I really like explicitly, truly, I think this is a strength, advising the assembly for the capital improvement projects. Because I'll tell you, often we send those recommendations in, and as far as we can tell, they go directly into the circular file. So I like that. And I haven't been able to think through if it should be expanded or if there should be some guaranteed recognition given to the capital improvement projects. I think this is great. I'm not saying get rid of it, I guess I'd like to footnote it or bookmark it for your further consideration when it comes forward in front of you.
Mr. Trini, then Julia.
Madam Chair, thank you. I put this in here because far too often the community councils never send their capital project list to the assembly. What we do is we get what's filtered through the administration. And that's not damning this administration. Every administration does the same thing. I wrote through 6 of them. They filter it and then they give it to the assembly when we do the capital projects list and say, this is from the community councils. I want to know directly from the community councils what you want in your capital projects list. Then it's up to me as your assembly member, do I take it forward or not?
Then we'll decide.
But I don't want to filter it.
Julia?
I like it.
Okay?
Ready?
All right, so I had one question about that, just to follow up. So we have in there that they're gonna advise it. How is it that they're gonna advise you?
Send us an email.
Is that it? Or do they file it with the municipal clerk and the municipal clerk includes it as an AIM?
whatever you think is best to get it to.
Well, let's talk about the policy.
I
part
would
of
say
it.
it would make sense to be an informational item on the agenda, because
Yeah,
then
yeah,
it's
it does.
entered into the record.
Yeah.
And so do they all come in at once, or does each community council bring one in and then the?
Well,
No.
as you can tell by the
What, I
the
don't-
last, some years out of 38 councils, I think that they may receive 6. I think the administration set up a new website this year that you can submit them online, you can edit them. So part of it might be to get assembly member access to that website. Or unless the councils want to submit them
We're
directly
gonna
to
go
the
this
clerk's
way,
office.
Al, then Kathy, then Mr. Briggs, then Mr. George.
I think that in the training of your council officers, that you always want to keep your assembly people advised of that list. I know you have always done that, and it's been successful. Like, for example, last year, we had a high priority project, we worked with our assembly members, and they got it on.
Kathy?
So, that's the key.
Well, yeah, as a council who has always done this, so we're one of those few who are very diligent about that, doing it every year. But I know there was a new website created earlier this year, and I tried submitting ours on that and had major issues, so I did it the old-fashioned way, and I emailed it and faxed it. So please don't put electronic requirements on things just because sometimes that's for people like me, although this is my last year's president. It could be a problem, so no, I wouldn't get too caught up on that.
It's again about that website, and I did find it helpful because it keeps track of last year's, this year's, you can reorganize, and the whole community can make a comment on the list. So it's not a secret, the whole community can see what it is, and we try to advertise it as much as possible so we get community input. Now, whether or not it's getting to the assembly members, I don't know.
Well, that's the guaranteed way of putting it as an yeah, it will. Mr. George, then Mr. Training.
Again, on the website, I had a lot of experience with using it this year, and I thought that for the first year of being up, it was pretty successful. One thing to note, though, is that you're still getting that administration filter. As a council officer, you provide the list, or you look at what's on there already, and you want to add a project that isn't there because somehow the administration hasn't had the foresight to see what you're going to propose. They have to approve your projects, and I think that ours submitted in May still haven't been approved, so they don't appear on there. They've been submitted, but they aren't actual projects on there. Additionally, there are projects on there that I looked at 8 years back at community council requests and couldn't find them in there. So that's been a long-standing concern of previous officers I've talked to.
Mr.
Just be
Training.
aware that that's an administration.
Thank you, Madam Chair. What I'm looking for here is, I'm trying to get the assembly members more involved with their community councils. Some assembly members go to every community council meeting. Some only show up occasionally when they're submitted a letter to them and says, please show up at our next meeting. I want assembly members to take more interest in the community councils. And the only way I know to do this is to make sure that you guys at community councils, on whatever day you want, whatever days you have to have it to administration, send it to us by AIM at clerk's office. But I wanted, the purpose of this is to know what you guys want, but also get our assembly members more involved in their community councils, because some don't really seem to care.
Mr. Butler.
Just talking to our vice chair at the FCC, as an employee of the FCC, we could, if the council was asked also to send it to the FCC, then we could forward it formally to the clerk's office or wherever you want it as well, if that's what they wanted us to do, if we could help. If we could help.
I don't mind having them CCing it, but I personally don't want to filter between the clerk and council.
Right. But we're talking unfiltered, just
Yeah,
forwarding an email.
I don't mind that being a CC, but that's my personal. Mr.
I think because the Federation, while I appreciate their mission, is not recognized in the charter and code, I think it would be, maybe you could ask the councils when they submit it to the clerk's office, the Federation could ask that the councils copy the Federation so they have copies on file, but it needs to go, in my opinion, directly to the clerk.
Because here's another reason, when we deal with the capital project list, I go through mine, and if I don't have a corresponding request from Avalon Community Council, and I see some project on there, the administration said, hey, this community council wants this, I'm gonna ask them, okay, where'd you find this from? It wasn't a request from the community council, because a lot of times when I was chairman, we'd put projects on, we'd never see them get to the assembly. They were lost in space. Or things like tennis courts show up.
Mr.
But that's
Tisdale?
another issue.
Thank you. It just seems like whether the community councils pass it through the Federation Housing on is an internal matter that can be decided at the Federation meeting. It's not for something as broad scope as that. I'd suggest we handle it that way.
It's a waste of time.
Mr. Hess, and then we'll move on to the next
I'm
topic.
sorry, I had an epiphany. This goes back to my heartburn with different administrations as a community council president. Under municipal responsibilities to community councils, it talks about responses to community councils down here and starting on line 39. Could we actually put in this code, could the assembly put in the code, a requirement that the administration respond in writing to the council's either email or letter? Because I never heard back.
Like an acknowledgement they received it.
That they received it, or even responses to the proposals. Right, a thank you, and we're looking at these, but you know, I grabbed Mayor Begich and took him on a ride through the neighborhood, and that's the only way I got a response. He would tell me on some of our, that will never happen, we'll never support it. But I don't think councils frequently, you have your top 10 priorities, and I've never heard from one council officer that's heard back from the city, we don't like this, this is terrible, oh, we're gonna support this. And I think that's the issue is they percolate on these lists, are they ever gonna happen? Or do they just keep them on there to,
I think that.
Well, you have it in code now. I mean, that's what current code says.
well, but it doesn't
It says the
specifically.
appropriate municipal official shall issue an informative response within a reasonable time. And so it's, you made it mandatory and they're not gonna,
So put 'em in
you
jail.
know.
Julia, within 30 days, let's change that. So within 30 days, the community councils will have a response from administration.
We're getting
It's
a
a
little
policy
too
decision.
deep in terms of.
It's a policy decision for the assembly to make.
A certified letter.
Yeah, then they can go to the ombudsman when the administration doesn't, and the ombudsman can write up the administration. I mean, that's good. I mean,
Just
I
submit
think
it.
you
I
can
don't
put 30
care
days,
how
it's
it's
already in there reasonable time, I think that's a good idea.
Tim, are you chairing in the chair's absence here?
No, Dick is.
Yes.
Well, I'd have to go back and verify this, but to the best of my recollection, actually, I think in the last few years, when Jim Lamson was getting this list, he actually did respond, at least to Jernigan.
Yeah.
But he's not
Everybody
around anymore, I
responds to
guess.
trying to get
But-
afraid of you.
Well, that's probably true.
You say that like it's a bad thing, Dick.
But I think on the website, it's not, I don't recall receiving anything like in my inbox. But I think at some point, there is a response on the website you click on, Jernigan, and then, I don't know what the response or what, that it actually is there, and it kind of goes line by line saying, this is not on the, AMAT's list for the next 10 years, this isn't on this is a state project, not a community project. That we've gotten some very scripted feedback, and I think it's put on the website. We're not told it's there. You have to know to look there. So I think there has been some to a certain degree, but it's not as good as it could be. It'd be nice for the council actually to get something, a letter, an email, something, so you know there's a response. It's not just posted on the website.
Agree with Kathy.
So do you think that in bringing that up, so collectively and back to what you guys were asking me, do you think that in B, where it says response to community councils, in the event of a written communication from a community council requesting information, recommending municipal action, that we need to add including the priority list of capital improvement projects, comma, or modification of municipal law, or acting upon the municipal proposal, the appropriate municipal, so do we need to highlight that including the capital improvement project list?
Right, you need to enforce it.
Mr. Steele?
We need to enforce it.
Well,
And
if
it
you
says
have
right
a
here they're supposed to
reasonable-
do it.
Well-
And, if they don't do it, if we don't do it, shame on us.
I think to Julia's point, we're highlighting the priority list further up under E. So why not call it out down here also? And it kind of lets everybody, the administration and the assembly know, this is a priority for the community councils. And they take time to put it together and a lot of thought into it. It deserves a response.
Otherwise, we're gonna be bitching about this for another 20 years. We submit projects, we never hear back from administrations where it's ever happened. They go into black hole and never hear a thing on it. I'd like to get a response to the community councils as
Give
to.
them 21 days in the high side.
What?
Give them 21 days, that's it.
Calendar days.
Well, you know, I
Yes,
mean,
Kathy.
well, thinking back, I mean, the 2013, but we voted on in June and I submitted, I haven't received any response. I haven't thought to go on the website to see if there's a response. When councils like Jernigan, if it's up to me, tend to wait at the last minute. If you've got a deadline, I think it was June 30th or something, they may get flooded, in theory flooded, by 30-some community councils with a list. To ask them to respond to all those by 21 days is, I think, unrealistic. If only 6 are doing it on an average basis, it's not unrealistic, but I would hate to tie their hands too much. But since I submitted it in June and it's August now, you know, probably I think that would have been a reasonable response time by now. But, you know,
I just want a response.
I want to be somewhat flexible to administration who are burdened with lots of work, but still be responsive to councils.
Al?
Well, I think in as much as they want us to submit everything, you know, electronically, there's no harm in any work, you know, for them to do.
I could have a standard, thank you, we've accepted, we've received your list.
Just
Yeah.
reply back and say thanks.
'Cause sometimes
Oh,
like a black
we've
hole,
always
you
gotten
never hear
that.
anything.
Sure.
Oh, yeah, I've always gotten an acknowledgement that they've received it, but just as far as a response to our list. I mean, maybe we're talking about two different things.
Arguments as to why.
Yeah, this
why
says
not.
an informative response, this isn't an acknowledgement. And I think that 30 days, if you can float that as a reasonable time. I don't think 21 days is the same reasonableness that 30 days is, for the reason that Kathy said. And then maybe with the second sentence there on the top of page 11, where it says, if the municipal officials cannot comply with the request, maybe we should massage that so that it's sort of like the response to a FOIA request. If they can't do it within that time, then they still have to, within a amount of time, tell you when they are gonna do it. Because a commitment without a deadline is not a commitment.
That's right.
All right. Any other questions on this topic? Okay.
So will we get maybe some language as
I
coming
think
up?
Joey can work on the language
Yeah.
for us.
Yeah, I'm not
Okay.
gonna wordsmith it here.
Sure, no, that's great.
Do we
No,
have to
I
have
mean,
that
just-
back?
What? What? I didn't hear you, Jim.
Do we have to have it back? 21 days?
Mr. Churchill, do you have a comment?
No, no.
And then the assembly members will talk to the municipal clerk about the AIN, because we still have that, my understanding is a consensus of the assembly members here.
That they will
that
come
that-
AAMs to us, to the clerk's office. We'll talk to Barbara in a few minutes.
Okay, next topic. You're done?
I
Okay.
am, thank you.
Anyone other than Mr. Twain have any comments or things that they want to highlight at this before we move on? No? Okay. Another one, Daniel, go ahead.
I'll be reading, this is more of a suggestion that's been brought to me from other folks beyond our council as well, that for coordination, perhaps maybe for training of officers, in coordination with that, if elections were requested or suggested to be in a certain time frame, maybe the second half of the year, the third quarter, whatever, so you don't have elections all throughout the year, 37 councils, the flux turnover, if you would suggest that councils have elections in maybe the third quarter, the fourth quarters.
So can I translate that? So it sounds to me like that as we develop the pro forma bylaws, which are sort of the default bylaws, that we might have an election date in there instead of a blank.
That's actually what we're going to next, so it's a great.
And
segue.
so that then, it's not in code that they all have to have it, because as we said, the policy sort of is to give you maximum, but that way, unless they changed it, for some reason known to the peculiarities of the individual community council, all be having elections at a certain time. Does that sound like?
Thank you. I'll let Madam Chair take that comment.
Okay, so the next item that we're gonna discuss is if everyone saw the template that Daryl's provided us with the bylaws. Daryl, I'll let you just briefly discuss that if you like.
I was asked to come up with some model bylaws, so I looked at all the different community councils, looked at the revised ordinance, and my quandary was whether or not to do bare bones minimum draft bylaws just based on the code requirements. And this is a rough draft, which I hope I'm going to send out to everybody and hope that they would comment on it. But when I was looking at it, at all the different bylaws, I saw some language in some bylaws that I thought were great and that other councils might appreciate. So what this is a quick draft, and after I get comments, I'm gonna go through and I'm gonna put by each section whether it's code requirement or optional. And that would allow community councils, I don't think everybody's gonna go reading 34 sets of bylaws like I did. And I saw some things in there that I thought was really great. So if you look through here, like under functions, which is on page 2, I should have numbered the pages. The ones in bold, they're required. These are spelled out in the ordinance. But then I saw in some bylaws, the F through J, I thought there were some great items there that maybe all community councils might want to consider putting in their bylaws. So when you go through these bylaws, I've tried to call out what's required or what isn't required, what's optional. And then, so if it doesn't say not required by code, it's optional. But when I go through this, I'm gonna go through and put optional or code, just kind of make it a little easier to understand. And then there's some things like the quorum requirements, they're up to the council. So if it's something that's strictly up to the individual councils, I'll call that out. Because one thing, if you look in here, when it comes to, there's one section, and I pulled this, a couple of councils now have this, vote reporting and official contacts. That's not required by code. Officers, the code requires that the bylaws provide for the election of officers, their term of service, and the designation of an executive board, but the details are left up to the individual council. So when you look at some of these things, and that's why I need to call out what's optional and what's code, because some entire sections is entirely up to the councils. Qualifications for officers, how they elect their officers, their duties, that's up to the individual councils. So if you get a chance, read through these, and you can send me comments, or if you have comments right now, we can go through them page by page.
I think it's probably best for us to take them and digest them, and then we can email you comments.
I'll second that motion.
Yeah.
It's like getting 4 lawyers together, you'll get 4 opinions, and I know how long that'll take, so.
At least 4.
Julia?
I wanted to just amplify what Daryl said if you look on the very back on page 8, there's sort of this category, which is where a process for dissolution is required by the code, by the code, the redrafted code, but the details are left up to the individual council. So what the intent was is to provide a template so that the individual councils don't have to go researching what a dissolution is. They have to have a dissolution process, but if they want to change this one, then they can. But this way we have a default to bridge between the time the code goes into effect and they submit bylaws. The other thing that I wanted to ask, I had a question in terms of policy on the draft that has to do with the bylaws that I don't know if you look at the top of page 5, under B, it says, after any code change requiring the submission of new bylaws for assembly acceptance, or differing or additional bylaw provisions, community council bylaws shall be deemed amended in conformity with new requirements of this chapter as set out in Exhibit A. So we will have a set of bylaws that'll be the final of this one, that'll be out there in Exhibit A, published in the code, until assembly acceptance of modifications or new bylaws from the community council. And then we have the requirements. Well, one of the things that I wondered about was in the notes from last time, we talked about the reasonableness of what time, is it 120 days? Is it so many days from when the next council meets? And so I sort of captured that in the very last section, or towards the end of the.
Kathy, she's actually looking at the,
Thank you.
Yeah.
We're not at the bylaws
No.
anymore?
No, I had
We're
to
back
skip
to the
that. We're
original.
we're
Sorry.
we're
It
talking
was-
about bylaws.
yeah, it was
but we're in
page
the-
5 at the top, item B, is what Julia was referencing.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I look
Julia,
back.
go ahead. I
Yeah,
saw
no, thank
a
you, thank you,
confused
yes.
look on multiple people's
I'm
faces.
sorry to switch documents. There. So again, that's where, as I talked about when Amy asked me to start out with, where we put the default. So it's both a pro forma and then this default provision that'll kick in, assuming the Department of Law says that we can go ahead and do that. But then if you look down on page 13 of this same document, at the very bottom is section 2, and that's where it's not, so it wouldn't be in, it's not codified, but it's included in the ordinance, that within 120 days from the first community council meeting, it should be after, not after, the effective date of this ordinance, each community council shall file new or amended bylaws in conformity with 244 as amended by ordinance, and then it has, how they go in front of the assembly for acceptance. I don't know that you have to have any time certain because you have that fallback of saying that the other ones go in. But if, as a guide, you have it here, there isn't really an enforcement mechanism. I mean, there's no.
What if they don't?
Well,
I mean,
Yeah,
then you-
yeah,
then you have
it's
the
the,
default.
it's
If
the
they aren't
same.
active,
I know.
maybe we ought to take them off the rolls.
Well, that's another
That's-
discussion. That's another
Well,
discussion.
so figure that, I mean, that's for the policy makers to figure that out, because the way, in creating the fallback, some community councils will say, we're happy with Exhibit A, those are ours, so we're, so it's, what do you wanna do about that, I guess, is a question that I wanna leave the policymakers with.
I personally have no problem keeping the 120 days in there just because I know how people operate and it's nice to have some sort of time point. Because otherwise you won't get people engaged. And even if the discussion we're having, I totally agree with you. Like, we probably don't even need it there. But I personally would like it there because it'll give my councils a time frame into which they're gonna make sure they get this reviewed and cut up to
On
date.
a time frame.
I like that. Daryl?
I think part of the problem is, and that's why this is a good discussion, is I think the ordinance was last amended in 2005, 2006, and that's when the requirement was put in that the bylaws be submitted to the assembly. When I looked through the 34 sets of bylaws, there were only a handful that meet the requirements of the code that was passed in 2005, 2006. So the assembly, basically the city mandated this, but nobody on our end followed up on it. So I think it's good that you have that process and that timeline in there, that make sure we do it.
Mr. Steele?
I guess I think it ought to be done. The question in my mind is, when these folks come back and when we get this passed, and they're from their summer hiatus, whatever it is, whether we, I guess I'm just a little bit hesitant to say, this is so darn important, you ought to drop everything else and do it. because there are community councils that have a lot of things on their plate. And we're saying you've got to not only hash or update them, but you've also got to hash them through and get them passed. And 120 days, we can say with one postponement until, for another 90 days or 60 days. I don't know, but it just seems to me, this is a volunteer group, and I don't want to load a whole bunch of stuff on them when they've got a lot of stuff on. So.
I would just like to comment that they don't have to have them passed in 120 days, they just have to have them filed. And,
No, those
Well,
would.
they're not gonna file
Yeah,
until
they
so
pass.
until they pass them, they have to pass them.
well, they do, but what I'm reading is they have to pass them. Oh, that's retarded. I thought you meant at the assembly. I'm so
We
sorry,
don't-
I misunderstood what you were saying. Yeah.
So my questions are,
I want to be a little lenient on that.
I think 120 days is adequate, it's 4
Yeah,
months.
Sure.
But that's just me, maybe I'm, Mr. Churchill, can you,
I
and
don't-
then we'll go back to Julie.
I don't have a problem with 120 days, and maybe as Mr. Steele's saying, if you want to put a provision in there that a
We'll
written
give you those
extension
60.
can be requested,
Yeah.
a written request, for those fail-safe things, that takes care of, I think, all
And then
corners.
if we don't get them, do we dissolve the?
I liked your jail idea with the assembly, I thought, no.
Well, the whole point is if they don't get them, then that's when if we don't get them, these.
those are in effect from the date you pass the
Until we
ordinance.
get the new ones.
Until you approve the new ones.
Yeah, I'm fine with that too.
And so it's hard to say that they get dumped for not having bylaws, because we've created a mechanism where they don't. So another avenue would be a much longer period, so that you give them a year to confirm, and then if they don't confirm, then they have to re-up as,
Yeah.
get
I just
recognized
hate
as
to
other
say
sources.
any part of town is, we're gonna
Okay, we're gonna.
shut you down if you aren't.
Madam
back.
Chair.
Yes,
Well,
Mr.
you're the
Tree.
one that brought it
I
up.
know.
We're gonna go to Mr. Trini.
120 days with a written request for another 30 days is acceptable, but I want this thing done. I don't wanna put it off forever, I wanna give them a time limit to get it done. And I worry if we put it off too long, we'll be in the summer season next year and they'll never get it done.
Get it
Well,
done,
and
that's
I would
it.
rather do it with this assemblies, because we know what we're doing, and rather than change. Mr. Trini and then Daryl.
I think the sooner we get it done, the better off we are.
Yeah.
We have to make some changes, give it a year to work, see how things are going.
Sure.
That's it.
I get,
Daryl, and then Mr. Steele.
I agree, we need to have a time frame. It is important, and why it's important, if you read the code, it says for a council to be recognized and maintain recognition, your bylaws must have these provisions. And back to what you were saying, yes, the assembly can unrecognize the council if they do not follow the requirements of the code. So, but at the same time, I agree, you get an extension if they want to. I'm willing, I'll help them with the draft or whatever. I think this go-round, we will offer them some assistance and some resources and won't let them down like we did the last time.
Mr. Steele.
and it could be as much as, if you haven't done it, if we don't get it, these are your bylaws.
It already says that.
All right.
And I'm fine with that.
It already
She-
it
she
says that
agrees
these
with
are the,
I'm fine
these
with
are
that.
your bylaws.
Get her done,
unless
or
you
we'll
change
wait for you.
them. But the,
Great minds think alike.
If you pass this, I will do that.
Next.
They don't meet this
Did
in
you
their
have something,
bylaws.
Warren?
Yes, I do. Just to point out to you on the difference between the model bylaws and the code update is talking about the management of the council finances, include regular status reports and annual reports of the council, to the council members on the council finances or contemplation of treasurer's reports.
so where are you on that?
Number 7, page 5. When you get over to the model bylaws, you get very specific as to what is a treasurer's report. I can tell you for the past year, the treasurer report consisted of one line. This is what the balance is. I like the model bylaws, what they require, list of expenditures. You gotta know what's coming in, what's going out, and why. But the code doesn't say what a treasurer's report
And that's a good catch, I will change that to match the code.
Mr. Trainer?
Well, I think what he's saying is that you might wanna change the code to match the
Match.
bylaws,
He
that the
likes the
code
bylaws.
is too open on that,
And
that
if-
it's too minimal for what it should be required of the treasurer's report, if I'm understanding it.
You're understanding correctly, because I'm concerned about transparency.
Mr. Trainer?
There's just one community council I know that there is no treasurer and nobody can sign on the account. There's still money out there, but there is nobody authorized to sign on the account. And that becomes a problem. We don't have transparency because they've changed officers and they've never updated who can sign for it. So it's a problem. It's good to have an updated treasury report every month. Yes, Al, sorry.
Oh, no, you're good. Teamwork.
I think it makes, a good point, is that, well, we have the actual bank statement there every month. Treasurer gives a report, anybody wants to take a look at the bank statement, they can, it's there. Here's what come in, here's what went out, and here's who it went to. You need to have that. I think I've got a question on minutes. As you know, these secretaries are hard to come by. And what I would like to see is perhaps that we could record those, record our minutes.
I was gonna say, our community council has this really cool device where we put it out and we tell everybody when we start the meeting, just so everybody knows you're being recorded, and then we post it to our website. So, I mean, that might be a substitute for actual, I don't know.
Okay, so where are you, is that something that's in the code on the requirements?
I just happened to bring it up. I think it's in there someplace on minutes.
Well, under the bylaws, the
Yeah.
default bylaws, it's under the duties of officer, secretary, whatever page that is.
Minutes should be taken at all meetings, so number 6, right above where Warren was on number 7, we wanna make sure that they can be electronic recording, right?
Just take an
In code.
electronic recording of the minutes.
So it's sort of, so should it be that minutes should be taken at all meetings, or should it be that the meeting should be electronically recorded, or either
Either
or?
way.
Either or. Because the point is that people have an idea of what
Needs
happened
to be a
at the
permanent
meeting.
record, there needs to be a record.
So if you're not gonna have written minutes, you should have audio available, I would think. But you don't have to though. As long as you have
Or
minutes.
you can have or too,
Yeah.
electronically.
Yeah,
Or yeah,
Daryl, and then Kathy, and then Mr. Tremaine, I know has something.
Well, I didn't realize, I didn't catch this in the revised code, that these model bylaws would be the default bylaws, because to be honest, they're a lot more detailed than the code requirements, so that we probably need to talk about that a little bit more, because it's telling you what the secretary's supposed to do and the treasurer, and that's one thing we avoid in the code, telling volunteers what their deadlines are and things. So-
right, and so and that's why they're the default, because they can fix it, but you can't just put what's in the code, because that wouldn't be enough for a bylaw. And so what Mr. Tremaine had talked about before, and where we came up with this, is that you really do need to flesh it out. It's not mandatory, they get to change it. But it's a lot easier for them to change something that's in writing
Than try to
than
come
it
up
is
their
to
own.
come up with it all their own. And so the intent was that it wouldn't, that your bylaws would have more detail, and that's, so another thing, and that's why I started with that comment about the 1 or 2. The default bylaws are gonna be a place where we're gonna have to decide in the default bylaws if it's gonna contain in the default that they can restrict people or not on voting for officers. Because you gotta go on one side or the other, and the code says you can do either one. And so those are sort of things to decide how the default's gonna look, because if you put that they can restrict, then Lauren's group has to come back and undo it. And if you put that they can't restrict, then Turnigan has to do it. So we're not gonna be able to satisfy everybody's bylaw, but you're gonna have to do something, and then hopefully we'll have enough circulation so that those I guess this is what I understood and expected from our last meeting, that if we got these done and that they were in at the same time, by the time this comes in, these copies are all around, so anybody who, like Lauren says, whoa, I don't, this default is gonna say that we have to restrict, no. And so he can have his counsel be ready to pass it, right away and submit it. There's nothing to restrict anybody from doing that now, so that they get in, so at least they have some idea with the default ones, what is gonna be acceptable. So we're giving them ones that are pre-approved. That's what the code says. These are pre-approved. You make a little change and the change is compliant with code, those are gonna sail in as accepted, because it just makes Daryl's life a lot easier. And so that was the vision there from last meeting, right?
Al, did you have something?
No, I think to accept
I can't-
next.
I just had
You
a
had
quick,
your hand up.
yeah, I mean, I would definitely say written, I would not say written and recorded. I mean, I
Either
can tell
or.
just the setting of where our meeting is.
Some people don't want to
If you
record
put a tape recorder, it's not gonna catch
Needs to
the
be a-
quality of a
Right, we
basic
put or,
recorder,
we
isn't
put or.
it
I
gonna
never thought
catch
it was both.
what
I
people are
just wanted to make
saying?
sure we can include
So,
both as an
yeah,
option.
yeah.
And so
Some
I
councils
misspoke.
might not like their meetings being recorded,
Yeah,
You never know.
logistically, it may not work for
When you
everybody.
get 40 people
Okay.
talking.
Yeah, that's
How you-
challenging.
Yeah.
Have an option.
But
Okay.
I know.
Did Mr. Tremaine have something?
Just to say that this is a great straw man, but it obviously needs work, and then we can start to talk about it.
Yeah, I concur. That's why I think we should really go back and look at these and present these, to our council. It's a starting point. And that's what this entire process is meant to be, is collaborative. It's not supposed to be top down, it's supposed to be collaborative, and we can't do that without engaging people, so. Did you have comments? Mr. Steele?
It might be, because we don't want to take out of this the rationale and the items that are in there, in the default or the example there. It may be easy enough just to whip up a minimal set of guidelines that somebody can just take off the shelf, or we can say, if you don't want to do it yourself, here's what you're gonna be working under. I mean, that's got options in it, it's got all kinds of things, but if they don't want to, or they're not active enough to do it, then we may say, okay, well, here's a 2-page bylaws that meet the minimal requirement.
What we could do is pull out everything that is
Oh,
required in
examples.
code, plus have one-year election of officers. The election has to be in April, whatever month we agree upon, and then you have those basic, that becomes your bylaws, but here's a template that offers you some options.
Not trying to give you direction.
No, well, that'd be easy to do, because I've already marked what's
Yeah.
required in code in my notes.
Did you have something? Can you just state your name for the record, Tim?
Yes, absolutely. My name is Heather Harris, and I'm with Alaska Youth Advocates. And Deborah Williams had to take off a little bit early as well with the Anchorage Youth Development Coalition. And we were just here paying attention to the 16 to 17-year-old aspect of the bylaws, and wanted to say a big thank you to this working group and the work that you've done here, and appreciate thinking about the young activists in our community and those that want to be involved in our community councils as well. And so I appreciate thinking about that and including them in the process and preparing them to be really great leaders in the future. So thank you.
Mr. Tremaine?
Just ma'am, once this passes the assembly, we'll need your help to get the youth involved. Because many of them don't know what community councils are.
Absolutely.
We need to get them involved while they're young. So that's the
Absolutely.
reason we're changing the age requirements. We appreciate your help.
Absolutely.
One of the things that I was tasked with at the end of last meeting, and you can, and I'm so glad you're here to help us on it. The group tasked me with finding out to confirm what the legal age of majority was in Alaska. And the focus there was about whether the youth members could run as officers and what kind of a predicament that could, because we would get questions about that. And so with specificity, I was asked to check about what the rules are for banking. Can they be signers on the account? Can they do all this? And so this is what I'm confirming. And then you're gonna know more about this than I am, but I'm confirming that the legal age of majority in Alaska is 18. and a person has to be 18 to make a contract binding. However, when it comes to bank accounts, many banks allow, and they go ahead and take the risk of different things with opening accounts directly in the name of youth that are not 18. And this is all absent emancipation, I'm just talking about youth. And that even under contract law, there are certain things, even if there's no written contract, that 16 and 17-year-olds can be held responsible for the cost of. And some of those things are, and they're within the umbrella of necessity. So I take it to mean that if a youth goes in and rents a hotel room, that the hotel can come back, and there are just that kind of exceptions. Housing is a necessity, food's a necessity. They can't go to a restaurant, order food, and not be held accountable. I guess that's how that works. And so but even if they are allowed to open an account, to the extent that banks and financial institutions have requirements for signers, it's not favored to have those people be under 18 because it's not going to count as a necessity, and it could be troublesome to for the organization. And so when that happens, it's because it hasn't been disclosed. So some nonprofit has looks like that everybody is over 18, but they allow the election of officers. There's a treasurer even if it's an unassociated group of investment people, and then they go to sign, then if the institution checks and finds out that the Merrill Lynch account is going to be opened, and the officers that have to sign for that any of them are under 18, then they won't accept it. So that's my report out.
Kathy and then Darren?
Yeah, well, I know we discussed this pretty heavily last time, but I didn't know we kind of, as a group, came up with a consensus.
I don't think we did, that's why it's still in.
It's still in, it's being added, and it's being added to the draft. As far as officers, because we especially talked about, well, kind of maybe have it both ways as far as non-voting members. You can be non-voting members at 16 and 17 on commissions and boards, municipal commissions and boards if they're non-voting. So we kind of talked about that. Compromise, and as far as officers, especially based on what you said, treasurer in particular, would that come under a council's flexibility on the criteria for officers? That one, like you wouldn't allow somebody under 18? Would that be code, or would that just be individual bylaws that we could put that in?
We were thinking alike. That's what I had my hand raised about. The way to address this, 16 and 17-year-olds who are members appointed as members by the mayor and confirmed by the assembly to advisory boards and commissions are voting members.
They are voting.
But they cannot, because they are advisory boards, just like a community council is an advisory body. That's why 16 and 17-year-olds can't be appointed to adjudicatory or regulatory boards or commissions because there are requirements. So this would be something we could probably put in the code, but I would say councils definitely could put in their bylaws. I think it's reasonable that for legal liability issues or however you would word it, that councils could put minimum age requirements, 18 for officers. That's the way to address that. It would allow 16 and 17-year-olds to be voting members, but it would also allow we recognize in code currently that the qualifications, the duties, the elections of officers is up to the council. So that is something that the councils can put in their bylaws to protect themselves.
Daniel?
Just really quickly, I would be honored if my council elected someone who is a young individual. That being said, Daryl mentioned that we are advisory bodies, and that's true. We're not regulatory or adjudicatory. but we have financial resources that we manage. And I think in our council, we've got more than $20,000 in a patrol grant that we're looking at buying a car with. That's a pretty serious state grant decision that if, you know, we have to have multi-party sign the checks, you know, there may be some gray area there. Maybe leaving it up to the councils to determine their agents is a solution, but it doesn't leave us with a lot of guidance from the council perspective. I would love to see more participation, but there are duties that go beyond my share.
So you would be in favor then of limiting, maybe, a 16-year-old not to being an officer because of the financial responsibility, is that what you're saying?
I'm concerned. I would like to see a solution where we can have minors be officers, but have some kind of guidance given to us as far, or maybe an opinion, as far as maybe they just can't partake in any kind of vote to expend funds. I mean, whatever would be most appropriate, but to still encourage participation. Maybe, I don't know if, I have terrible things, I don't know if you guys have done a decision
Around,
being responsible for the finances as far as organization.
there's some research around fiduciary decision-making in 16 to 17-year-olds, and so I can provide you with that research.
What does that research say?
That you have to really separate out the fiduciary responsibility because they're 16 and 17 and haven't reached majority. Essentially.
So let me narrow the focus here, because sometimes we're talking about it as they're an officer of the board, like Kathy said, treasurer. And so my legal advice to any corporation that I'm involved with is that you cannot have somebody who's under 18 be your treasurer, because there's too many things that they have to sign, and the banking institutions aren't gonna allow that, and it just puts it in jeopardy. So that's one issue. So, you know, you might have them be shadow, or, you know, assistant, or, you know, some kind of mentorship. Right.
Yeah.
Then the second issue that I hear come back in different ways is, what about voting on financial issues? And so the way that this code is written now, as a policy decision after the discussion that we had there before, is that 16 and 17-year-olds are full voting members, whether it's a fiduciary issue or not. And so that's where I'm at, that's the focus of my question about that. And so does the research indicate that when it comes to voting on financial issues, that the 16 and 17-year-olds should not be full voting members? Is that what you're coming up with?
That's my understanding. I think we can look back at it, but those financial, anything that would come back on them on a financial aspect potentially, they're not able to participate in that voting process.
Well, that's different coming back on them, but what they're talking about is financial issues on how we're gonna spend our money. Are we gonna have, make a contribution to the Gamble Street corridor? Do they get to vote on that, or is it because it involves the expenditure of money that there's this body of research that says that 16 and 17-year-olds shouldn't vote?
And my experience has been around nonprofits where they could be fiduciarily responsible, and so this moves into kind of advisory, so it makes it a little bit gray for me, but I think that we have the research that could answer that question.
Great.
Julia, what you want to do is look at a restriction for age on treasurer. They have to reach age majority to hold that office within the community council.
What about president?
And that would probably, I don't care about the
Well, our
president.
Well,
president
same
can write a
thing, the
check.
president has to write checks and has to do.
Then you
so-
figure out some language, Julia, you're smart at it. Figure out some language that relates to financial issues, they've got to reach the age majority.
Or have a cosign or something.
Or something. No one-party checks require two-party, one has to be age majority. We're trying to figure out some way. I want the young people to be involved in this at every aspect. If somebody wants to be a community council president, they're young, I'm happy for them. Because I don't want to lose these kids. When they're young, I want to keep them. And so we've got to figure out some way to get them into this system.
And there's a lot of learning to take place in those types of.
And you can figure out some way to write it to protect them and us. Because I know on the Parks and Rec board, for example, we have young people on that, and they decide how to spend the Parks and Rec money.
Yeah.
So that's not an issue there. I just don't want to build a problem where none exists. Sometimes we do that.
Mr. Churchill?
Yeah, and just for everybody's comfort, we can put something together in the language. I know there's a worry about treating people differently, but if you've got a legitimate, non-discriminatory business reason for making these provisions, and you can articulate that reason, you're in pretty safe ground. And it sounds to me like between your research and yours, we'd be on solid ground, and I would be happy to help putting something together. It's just an informative piece saying, these are sort of the ground rules that you might want to think, so.
That would give the guidance that you're talking about.
Yeah.
You know, so that you have it in the.
For you, 50 cents, everybody else is a buck,
Yeah.
you know, but I think I would be happy to do that. The second thing, God bless you for reading all those bylaws, Daryl. Thank you so very much. This is worth its weight. Thank you.
But see, he's not done yet, when we go submit new
I
stuff.
didn't say he was done, I just thanked him for what he did.
His work is not done.
This is a great time. We're gonna go ahead and wrap up today, but, our next meeting, we're gonna set right now, the 27th,
7th of September,
27th of September,
yes.
2 o'clock.
And that gives us all time to go to community councils. Some are just meeting now the first time. Take this set of bylaws to them and get their input. And Dick, representing the Federation, if you could make sure all the community councils get this.
I'll send it tomorrow.
And we're gonna, I think both he and I, Daryl and I, are both gonna come to your meeting the 3rd Wednesday of the month and talk to you guys about it.
Okay.
I just wanna start to get some response from this. So we meet on the 27th, we can cut it down and build it back up again, because I wanna introduce this in October. Okay? So I don't wanna put it off forever, I wanna get it done. October's a good month to do it.
Okay, is there
Thank you
anything,
guys for being here.
is there anything else?
Thank you for running it, Amy. Good
Thank you
job.
for letting me, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. All right, meeting adjourned.